So what are P3s? So basically it's just a contract. It's a contract between public and private partner for the provision of some good or service. Usually it's a consortium of partners, so there'll be more than one company involved. And generally they are output-based performances. So the contract deals with the outcome of what the private or the public partner is looking to get out of the contract. And there is some degree of risk transfer. Of course, the devil's always in the details, but some good characteristics of a good P3 is that there are requirements for the private partner to deliver on time, on budget. There are quality standards, performance measurements, and there is risk transfer. This is probably not too clear, but these are types of P3s. They're varying. You go all the way down to the bottom left-hand corner, which is government, which is basically the government builds it, owns it, and services it, maintains it, all the way up to the top right-hand corner, which is privatization. Now there is a whole myriad of different scenarios between government and privatization, obviously.
The question is, what is a better way of looking at the development of public infrastructure and public service? And the first thing I would say is we need a good business case, first and foremost, and we haven't had that. We're wasting billions of dollars on inefficient projects and then quarreling about whether one way is marginally better than another. Business case first.
So right now, according to the TD Bank, they did a recent study stating that Canada's infrastructure gap, that is the money needed to actually bring up our infrastructure up to par, is somewhere in the range of $50 to $125 billion. Why is that? Well, frankly, it's politics. It's short-term governments that aren't necessarily looking forward to long-term capital asset management. So we have a dilemma. We need roads, bridges, highways, upgraded, maintained, expanded, but politicians generally are afraid to come back and ask us to give more of our paychecks, seeing how most of us give half of it already. So governments are looking for alternatives to traditional procurement, and this is where public-private partnerships have become the new buzzword, the new way of doing investments for public infrastructure.
And that's going to require more public funding of these projects, but that's nothing to be afraid of. Public funding means debt service. Private funding means lease obligations. There's still future obligations, but we want obligations that are going to be lower in cost. And we have to recognize that if there's benefits in risk transfer, we should look at the lowest cost way of achieving that risk transfer. We shouldn't be giving the projects to the private sector, saying that's the only way we can achieve the risk transfer we're looking for. For example, in the RAV project, I'll never forget listening to a report saying, RAV costs are going up, but it's okay, the private sector is going to contribute more. They'll fill the gap. They'll enable us to build projects that we couldn't otherwise afford. The problem with that, of course, is that these projects aren't built on spec. You don't see SNC-Lavalin building a rapid transit project and selling the service on the marketplace. These projects are built on the basis of a very long-term lease with government, and that long-term lease provides the revenues that pays for the capital that the private sector puts in. And that long-term lease establishes a liability. Taxpayers have to pay over the next 25 years, provided the service is there, the infrastructure is developed, they have to pay that lease payment. So it's much like a decision with respect to a house. Instead of buying the house and taking out a mortgage yourself, you have somebody else pay for the house for you. But if you enter into a 25-year lease obligation, or you're stuck with that lease, you have to pay that, you have a long-term liability. And now accountants recognize that there is no magic bullet. There is no off-book financing of public infrastructure. We can't get the private sector to build projects we couldn't otherwise afford. They are, these P3s, a public debt, though in a different form, in the form of a long-term lease, every bit as much as a direct government debt. So in the current rationale for P3s, it's not about a way to avoid debt. It's not about a way to build things that we couldn't otherwise afford, because if you can't afford to do it yourself, you can't afford to do it through a P3. You still have the same long-term obligation. The current rationale is all about the way in which you can get the private sector to deliver services, to deliver infrastructure in ways that might be more cost-effective than if government were to do it itself. So you look to P3s to transfer more risk to the private developers than you otherwise could. You look to P3s to provide more private sector innovation, perhaps more vigorous management. And the goal is, of course, not so much to avoid the costs of the bridges and the rapid transit lines and everything else we're building, but to try to deliver those things in a less costly way with better performance and more benefits than otherwise. In the language of Partnerships BC, the current rationale for P3s is to try to get more value for money, to try to get a better project at lower cost with greater benefit. And so the question is, how do we assess this value for money? Do we in fact get value for money from the P3s that we've seen in BC? With a P3, what happens is the government ends, and I'm thinking of the full meal deal P3, the design, build, operate, finance. The government will contract with a consortium to design, to build, to construct, to operate and maintain over an extended period of time, typically 25 years, to finance particular infrastructure. So we have the Sea to Skies project that was done that way. We have the Canada line, the RAV line. I call it the RAV line. I suppose now it's called the Canada line. The Abbotsford Hospital, other facilities that are developed that way. And what the government agrees to do is to pay availability fees, basically lease fees, provided that the service and the infrastructure is developed and maintained in a way that meets the standards of the contract. In traditional public sector procurement and financing, the government would still get the private sector to do most of the work. It would enter into contracts with a particular firm to design, perhaps to design and build the facility. In the case of highways, it'd enter into contracts with mainland contracting or other firms to operate and maintain. But the government would finance it, and the government would incur the debt servicing costs on whatever debt it needed to pay for the building of the project, the operating and maintenance costs for the ongoing operations of the facility. And in the value for money assessment, what's done is a basic comparison. How does the stream of lease payments that we expect to pay for the P3 compare to the operating and maintenance payments and the debt service payments we'd expect to pay with what Partnerships BC calls and what the value for money assessments call this public sector comparator, a traditionally procured and financed project. We've seen a couple of value for money reports come out in BC in the last year. One was for the Sea to Sky project. It was released in December of 2005. It was done by Partnerships BC. Another for the Canada Line RAV project, more recently released in April 2006. And they claim to demonstrate in those studies value for money, that these are better ways of developing that infrastructure than the public sector comparator, the traditionally procured and financed project. And I want to talk today about my own views on that, although I'll try not to be pejorative. My conclusion is they don't demonstrate that at all, that they don't demonstrate value for money. And they raise very significant questions about where we're going in the future with the billions of dollars of infrastructure that we need to build in this province, in transportation, in healthcare, in education, in the full range of public services and facilities that we require.
The whole idea of the P3s came from trying to get that magic bullet, trying to get the new infrastructure, but not having to incur the debt. And actually, that started with the Conservatives in Britain, who really implemented the ideas of P3s on a large scale. But they've been really expanded. It's called the Public Finance Initiative over in the UK, and it's been really expanded under the current Labour government.
To the narrow question of the comparison between P3s and traditionally procured and financed projects, the so-called public sector comparator, there's a number of problems with these assessments that are done, these value for money assessments. The first one is the nature and the timing of the comparison that's done. What's done typically in these studies, at least we saw for Sea to Sky and RAV, is an analysis after the P3 contract was concluded. So this isn't a forward-looking decision-making analysis. This is a justification for a decision that's already been made. It's problematic in its own right. But it also compares the costs that are defined in a contract, the P3, with a hypothetical circumstance of a public sector comparator, traditionally procured project that doesn't exist. So your benchmark, your key benchmark, is an abstraction, is a hypothetical, and it's compared to an actual contract. And that's very problematic. And the RAV value for money assessment really illustrates it well. In the RAV study, what they concluded was, actually it was the same in the Sea to Sky, the present value costs of the P3 were over $100 million more than the traditionally procured and financed hypothetical public sector comparator. But what they said was the station design and the frequency of service with the P3 would result in 34% more ridership than what you'd get if the government did it. Now, this is very bizarre to me because in both cases, TransLink is operating the service. So what they're saying in the contract, where they've worked very closely with SNC-Lavalin, figure out the station design, how many steps you have to go down to get to the station, where they're located, how much service will be offered, they realized they could do better than what they had originally thought. And that's why they have this higher ridership with the P3. But for some reason, in the hypothetical public sector comparator, same people operating the system, it's going to be TransLink that's running the service, those additional riders wouldn't appear. So you have a comparison that shows a marginal benefit for the P3, but it's based on an assumption that you're getting all this extra riders if you have the private sector design, build, and operate the facility, TransLink running the service, as compared to TransLink or the provincial government entering into a design build contract, operating and maintaining the system, and financing it itself. Very problematic comparison. You have to take these value for money assessments and recognize that they're not comparing apples with apples, they're comparing a contract with a hypothetical.
So where are we on the P3 radar screen? Well, we're quite slow, Canada. We're always quite hesitant to try new things. But to give you an idea of how big capital spending is in Canada, $17 billion if you look at capital spending by provincial and federal government, and just 1 year, $17 billion goes towards capital spending.
More fundamental problem is evaluation of risk. A major issue, if you like, in value for money assessments is the value of the risk that's transferred to the private sector in P3s that wouldn't be transferred under a traditionally procured project. So in the Sea to Sky evaluation, they assumed that the benefits of the risk transfer, the additional risk that the private sector takes on, would be some $80 million. In the RAV project, it was $240 million. And it's a bunch of magic as to how they get those numbers. And they also assume that some of that risk benefit couldn't be achieved in a traditional model. Bear in mind, these projects, and I'm thinking of highway projects and rapid transit in particular, are built by the private sector. They're built under contract with government, in either case. And if you wanted to fix the price, you could do that in a traditionally procured project. If you have to decide what risks you want to fix, you don't fix all risks. You fix those risks that you think the private sector can manage better than you can. But there's not a great reason why you need to have the private sector finance a project to transfer a lot of risk. In particular, the risk of cost overruns, the risk of performance. You can have warranties on performance. You can have bonds on performance. We do this all the time.
And in British Columbia, why P3s are such a big idea or been talked about so often is in 2002, the BC Liberals came out with what they called the Capital Asset Management Framework. This was based upon the example in Australia And Partnerships BC was established, which Dr. Shaffer mentioned a few times, and it was modeled on the experience of the state of Queensland, I believe, Partnerships Victoria. And we've had a few projects come up with that. Of course, the Abbotsford Hospital being one of the biggest. It's the first time BC has seen a new hospital in over a generation.
Another issue with the value for money assessments, and this is particularly true of Sea to Sky more so than the RAB project, the one that was done by Partnerships BC, is the assumed cost of capital. You know, a major benefit, I mean, one thing that government does well, and I'm the first to admit that government does not, you have to work for government to know that government does not do many things well. But one of the things it does do well is borrow money. And the reason I say that is it's a very safe creditor. People like loaning money to the government. In fact, if you talk to people at the Municipal Financing Authority, they talk about liquidity. What do they mean? They want to have more debt out there because then they can get lower rates because people can trade it better in the marketplace. Governments get very low, very attractive financing rates. So when we go to a privately financed highway or a privately financed RAB project in part, we're giving up the benefit of that low cost, that low interest rate. Yet in the value for money assessment of the Sea to Sky project, what Partnerships BC did is make the assumption that regardless of what the actual interest rate government would pay in its traditionally procured project, it's going to assume it's the exact same cost as the cost of capital that the private sector incurs, which in that particular case was 7.5%. And in the case of the traditional government financing right now, I don't know the exact rates, but I'm pretty sure it'd be 5% or less, which makes a huge difference. These are capital projects. It's all about the interest rates. And when you talk about another 2.5 percentage points on a $500 or $600 million project, you're talking $10 million a year or more. The private sector needs to worry about what's called contract risk. They'll run into governments that won't pay or want to change the rules. They have to build in an extra return for that. The private sector needs a return on the equity that it puts in, comparable to the return it could earn in investments around the world. Public sector doesn't need that. In other words, in this value for money assessment, there was a bias against the public sector comparator by ignoring the benefit of public financing.
So Quebec is following BC. They're setting up a very similar operation to Partnerships BC. Ontario has an infrastructure program and policy involving the private sector. Municipalities have been doing P3s for a long time. Why have they been doing it for a long time? Because generally municipalities don't have the borrowing capacity that provincial and federal governments do. New Brunswick has a P3 policy. We have a federal policy in place as well. Again, P3s generally aren't anything new. It's just more or less the terminology.
And the final point, and it's very much related to this, is the weighting of future costs. In technical terms, the discount rate, the discounting of future costs. When we enter into a P3 or even into debt service, we're imposing obligations on taxpayers for the next 25 years. And the question is, what weight do we give to the payments 25 years from now? And in the value for money assessments that Partnerships BC has done, they give relatively little weight. They use the time value of money that the private sector needs based on the rate of return that it could earn, not the interest rate that the taxpayers face, the weight that we would want to give to the imposition, the liabilities we're imposing on future generation. So just to give you a sense of the importance of this, using the discount rate that Partnership BC used, the weighting that it gave to future costs, the present value cost of the Sea to Sky project, operating and maintenance costs, construction, everything, was $790 million. If you use a discount rate that reflects government's borrowing rate, something that would give you an equivalent present value from a taxpayer point of view, the cost is $1 billion. And if you just added up the cost, what is it that we're going to be spending over the next 25 years on this project? It's almost $2 billion. So this really matters. We have to really consider the weight that we attach to future expenditures.